That is not what it says. The words sliced through the room so suddenly that even the air seemed to stop moving. Every conversation ended mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward the young black waitress standing beside the conference table. A pen slipped from someone's hand. A translator froze. And at the center of the room, Billionaire CEO Ethan Walker slowly lifted his head. For 3 full seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the soft hum of Manhattan traffic 40 floors below the glass walls of the executive dining suite. Naomi Bennett immediately realized what she had just done. She had interrupted a $500 million international deal. A deal involving attorneys, investors, executives, and representatives from one of Japan's largest technology firms. The kind of room where people like her were expected to refill water glasses, not correct legal translations. Yet she did not step back. She did not apologize. Instead, she looked directly at the Japanese document projected onto the giant screen and then back toward the translator standing beside it. The translator adjusted his glasses. His expression tightened. "Excuse me?" he asked. Naomi pointed carefully toward a specific line in the document. That sentence was translated incorrectly. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. Until that moment, he had barely noticed the waitress. He remembered seeing her bring coffee earlier. Nothing more. Yet now she stood in the middle of the room with a level of confidence that seemed completely out of place. One of the attorneys frowned. "This document has already been reviewed." Naomi nodded respectfully. "I understand." "Then what exactly are you saying?" another executive asked. Naomi took a slow breath. Every instinct told her to stay quiet. Every lesson she had learned about working in luxury hospitality told her that challenging wealthy people was rarely a good career move. But she also knew what she had heard, and she knew what she had read. "The Japanese version and the English version do not say the same thing," she replied. Silence followed. Across the table, representatives from the Japanese company suddenly appeared more interested. One of them leaned forward. Another whispered something quietly to a colleague. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty entered the room. The translator gave a short laugh. "I assure everyone the translation is accurate." Naomi's eyes remained on the document. "No," she said calmly. "It is not." The confidence in her voice was impossible to ignore. Ethan studied her carefully. She did not look nervous. She did not look like someone guessing. She looked like someone who knew she was right. The room had spent 6 months preparing for this partnership. Lawyers from both countries had reviewed contracts. Consultants had analyzed risks. Financial experts had approved projections. Hundreds of hours and millions of dollars had gone into the agreement. Yet now everything seemed to be hanging on the words of a waitress nobody had noticed 10 minutes earlier. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, he naturally commanded attention. "What exactly is wrong with the translation?" he asked. Naomi looked at him for the first time. Around her, executives waited impatiently. The translator folded his arms. The Japanese representatives watched with growing curiosity. Naomi pointed toward the screen. "The English version says your company will retain operational authority after the acquisition period." She paused. "But the Japanese document does not say that." A murmur spread across the room. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What does it say?" Naomi looked directly at the original Japanese text. Then she answered in fluent Japanese. The room instantly fell silent again. This time, even the Japanese executives appeared shocked. Their expressions changed completely. One of them sat upright. Another exchanged a stunned look with a colleague. Ethan could not understand the language, but he understood the reaction. Whatever Naomi had just said, it was important. Very important. Then one of the Japanese executives slowly turned toward Ethan and spoke in perfect English. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "I believe we need to stop this meeting immediately." For several seconds, nobody moved. The executive dining suite that had been filled with confidence only moments earlier now felt completely different. The Japanese representatives exchanged quiet comments among themselves. Attorneys flipped through printed copies of the contract. Investors stared at the projection screen. And standing near the back of the room, Naomi Bennett suddenly found herself at the center of attention she had never wanted. Ethan Walker looked from the screen to the waitress and back again. His instincts told him something important had just happened. The reactions alone made that obvious. Business negotiations often involved disagreements. They rarely involve shock. Someone explain exactly what is going on, Ethan said calmly. One of the senior Japanese executives adjusted his glasses before speaking. The sentence your translator read states that your company maintains operational authority after the transition period. He paused. However, the original Japanese wording does not say that. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Then what does it say? The executive glanced toward Naomi. Would you like to explain? Every eye in the room turned toward her again. Naomi immediately wished they had not. She was comfortable carrying trays. She was comfortable serving guests. She was not comfortable addressing rooms filled with billionaires and corporate attorneys. Yet the document remained on the screen. The words remained unchanged. And the truth remained the truth. Naomi took a slow breath. The original wording says authority transfers completely after the designated period. A murmur spread across the room. Ethan frowned. Completely. Naomi nodded. Yes. One attorney immediately stood. That changes everything. Another lawyer began rapidly reviewing pages on a tablet. Across the room, the translator's expression became increasingly uncomfortable. Ethan noticed. You are saying there is a significant difference between the two versions? He asked. Not a difference, Naomi replied carefully. A contradiction. The room fell silent again. Contradiction was a dangerous word in a $500 million agreement. Ethan walked toward the screen. The contract had undergone months of preparation. Legal teams from 2 countries had reviewed every page. Financial advisors had approved every projection. The idea that a critical clause could be translated incorrectly seemed almost impossible. Yet impossible things occasionally happened. How do you know Japanese? One investor suddenly asked. The question broke the tension for a moment. Several people seemed equally curious. Until 10 minutes earlier, Naomi had simply been a waitress serving coffee and water. Now she was correcting multilingual contract language in front of seasoned executives. Naomi hesitated. I studied in Japan. Ethan looked surprised. For how long? Almost 6 years. Several eyebrows rose around the room. The revelation changed how people looked at her instantly. It was subtle but unmistakable. A few minutes earlier, most of them had barely noticed her existence. Now they were reevaluating every assumption they had made. One Japanese executive smiled faintly. Your pronunciation is excellent. Naomi nodded politely. Thank you. Ethan found himself studying her more carefully. The confidence, the accuracy, the calm manner in which she handled pressure. None of it seemed accidental. Yet before he could ask another question, a new voice interrupted. Perhaps there has simply been a misunderstanding. Everyone turned. Richard Coleman had finally spoken. As chairman of one of the investment groups backing the transaction, Richard held enormous influence over the deal. At 55, he possessed the polished confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. He offered a reassuring smile. Translation issues happen all the time. Some people nodded. It sounded reasonable. But Naomi noticed something others missed. Richard had not looked at the Japanese document once since the discussion began. He had been watching reactions instead, measuring them, studying them. Ethan noticed it too. Then verifying the language should be simple, Ethan said. Richard's smile remained unchanged. Of course. Yet for the first time, Naomi saw a flicker of concern behind his eyes. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it completely. Naomi did not. Because years earlier, while living in Tokyo, she had learned something important. People often reveal the truth long before they speak it. And as attorneys began comparing every line of the contract against the original Japanese version, she could not shake the feeling that this was no ordinary translation error. The room never returned to its original rhythm. Even after the attorneys began comparing documents line by line, a sense of unease lingered beneath every conversation. What had started as a routine signing ceremony now felt more like an investigation. Ethan Walker remained standing near the screen, watching teams of lawyers review the Japanese and English versions side by side. Across the table, representatives from the Tokyo-based technology company spoke quietly among themselves. The atmosphere had changed from celebration to caution. Naomi Bennett wished she could disappear back into the background. For years, she had learned how to become almost invisible in luxury hospitality. Wealthy clients rarely remembered who served their coffee. They remembered deals, profits, and presentations, not waitresses. Yet now dozens of executives were watching her whenever she moved. It felt uncomfortable. Worse, it felt unfinished. Something still bothered her. She could not explain why. She simply knew that the translation issue felt too significant to be accidental. One of the Japanese executives approached her. He appeared to be in his early 60s and carried himself with quiet authority. "Your Japanese is remarkable," he said. Naomi smiled politely. "Thank you. Where did you study?" "Tokyo International University." The man's eyebrows rose. "Really?" Naomi nodded. "I received a scholarship when I was 20. Ethan overheard the exchange. "You lived in Japan for 6 years?" he asked. Naomi turned toward him. "Almost 6. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "Then why are you working here?" The question escaped before he could stop it. The room suddenly became quiet again. Naomi laughed softly, not because she was offended, but because she had answered the question many times before. Because life does not always follow the plan. Several people smiled. The answer felt honest. Yet Ethan sensed there was more to the story. Before he could ask further, one of the lead attorneys interrupted. "Mr. Walker, you need to see this." Ethan immediately crossed the room. A document had been enlarged on a secondary monitor. Several sections were highlighted in yellow. "We found another discrepancy," the attorney said. Ethan frowned. "Another one?" "Yes." The attorney pointed toward a paragraph. "This section changes financial reporting authority after acquisition." Ethan's expression hardened. "And the English version?" "It says the exact opposite." The room became silent once more. This time the silence felt heavier. One discrepancy might be a mistake. 2 discrepancies were harder to dismiss. Richard Coleman slowly approached the table. "Surely this is still a translation issue," he said calmly. "Complex legal language often creates confusion." His voice remained steady. His smile remained professional. Yet Naomi noticed something interesting. Richard was speaking more often now. Much more often. People who were comfortable usually listened. People who felt pressure often tried to control the conversation. Ethan noticed it too. "Then we should continue reviewing everything," he said. Richard nodded immediately. "Of course." But the response felt too quick, too polished. Naomi looked toward the original Japanese document again. Her eyes moved across several paragraphs. Years of study had taught her to recognize patterns in legal language. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly. Certain structures carried specific meanings. Then something caught her attention. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She stepped closer to the screen. One line, near the bottom, referenced a supplementary agreement. Naomi felt a chill run through her. "That document," she said quietly. Several people looked up. "What about it?" Ethan asked. Naomi pointed toward the Japanese text. "This clause references another contract." Attorneys immediately leaned forward. "Another contract?" one lawyer asked. Naomi nodded. "A separate agreement that is not attached here." The lead attorney's expression changed instantly. "Can you show us?" "Exactly where?" Naomi stepped forward and pointed to the original wording. The attorney translated it himself. Then he looked up slowly. "She is right." For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared on Richard Coleman's face. Only for a moment. Only a fraction of a second. But Naomi saw it. And in that instant, she became certain of one thing. The problem was no longer a mistranslation. Someone had been counting on nobody in the room understanding what the original Japanese documents actually said. The atmosphere inside the executive dining suite had transformed completely. What was supposed to be the final stage of a celebrated international partnership now felt like the opening chapter of something far more complicated. Attorneys no longer discussed closing schedules. Investors no longer talked about projected profits. Every conversation now centered on one question. Where was the missing agreement mentioned in the Japanese contract? The lead attorney adjusted his glasses and turned toward the representatives from Tokyo. "Was this supplementary agreement provided to your legal team?" The oldest Japanese executive nodded slowly. "Yes." The room became silent. Ethan Walker folded his arms. "Then why have we not seen it?" Another Japanese representative opened a folder and reviewed several pages before answering. "Because we assumed your side already had it." Ethan felt a chill move through him. Across the room, several attorneys immediately began searching through digital records. Laptops opened. Phones appeared. Messages were sent. The sense of urgency was impossible to miss. Naomi remained near the back of the room. She wished she could return to her normal responsibilities, but every new discovery seemed connected to the language she had identified. She watched carefully as people moved around the room. Some appeared concerned. Some appeared confused. One person appeared neither. Richard Coleman. While others searched for answers, Richard seemed focused on managing perceptions. He spoke often, reassured people repeatedly, suggested patience whenever tension increased. On the surface, it sounded helpful. Yet the more Naomi listened, the more uncomfortable she became. Ethan appeared to notice the same thing. 20 minutes later, one of the attorneys suddenly looked up from a laptop screen. I found a reference. Every conversation stopped immediately. To the supplementary agreement? Ethan asked. The attorney nodded. Yes. He rotated the screen toward the group. It exists. Relief briefly crossed several faces. Then the attorney continued. But there is a problem. The relief disappeared instantly. What problem? Ethan asked. The attorney pointed toward a line of text. This agreement was never included in the final review package. Silence settled over the room. Ethan stared at the screen. How is that possible? The attorney shook his head. I do not know. Another lawyer stepped forward. Can we access it? Not directly, the first attorney replied. The file was removed from the shared archive several weeks ago. Several people exchanged worried looks. Removed. Not lost. Not misplaced. Removed. The distinction mattered. Ethan slowly looked around the room. Who had authority to remove it? Nobody answered immediately. The attorney reviewed another page. Then his expression changed. Only a very small group of people. Ethan waited. Who? The attorney read the names. Senior legal counsel. 2 executive administrators. Then one final name. Richard Coleman. For the first time all afternoon, nobody spoke. Richard remained perfectly still. His expression barely changed. That proves nothing, he said calmly. Many people had access. His answer sounded reasonable. Yet something about it felt rehearsed. Ethan studied him carefully. Did you remove the file? Richard smiled politely. Of course not. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Naomi felt the same uneasy sensation she had experienced earlier. She looked back toward the original Japanese document still displayed on the screen. Something continued bothering her. Then suddenly she saw it. A small notation near the bottom margin. Tiny. Easy to overlook. Naomi stepped forward. Wait. Several people turned toward her. She pointed toward the Japanese text. There is another reference. The attorneys immediately moved closer. Ethan joined them. Naomi traced the line with her finger. This note says the supplementary agreement contains revised ownership percentages. The lead attorney translated the phrase himself. Then he looked up sharply. She is correct. Ethan frowned. Ownership percentages of what? Nobody answered right away. The attorney's eyes widened as he continued reading. Then he slowly looked toward Ethan. Your company. The room fell completely silent. Even the air seemed heavier. If the missing agreement altered ownership percentages, then this was no longer a question of translation errors or administrative mistakes. It was about control. And as Ethan looked across the room, he noticed something he had not seen before. For the briefest moment, Richard Coleman's confident smile disappeared. For several seconds after the attorney spoke, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang over the conference room like a storm cloud. Revised ownership percentages. Your company. Ethan Walker stared at the screen, trying to process what that could mean. This partnership was supposed to expand Walker Global Holdings into new international markets. It was never supposed to change who controlled the company itself. Yet the missing agreement appeared to suggest exactly that. Around the room, attorneys began speaking in hushed voices. Investors exchanged uneasy looks. The representatives from Tokyo appeared just as concerned. Whatever was hidden inside the missing document, it had not been fully disclosed to either side. Ethan slowly turned toward Richard Coleman. I want that agreement. His voice was calm, controlled, but nobody missed the seriousness behind it. Richard adjusted his cufflinks and offered a reassuring smile. I am sure there is a simple explanation. Ethan did not return the smile. Then finding the document should be simple. Richard nodded. Of course. Yet once again, Naomi noticed that same brief hesitation before he answered. It was tiny, barely visible, but it was there. The room erupted into activity. Legal teams contacted archives. Assistants searched secure databases. Multiple versions of the contract were compared side by side. What had begun as a signing ceremony now resembled a corporate audit. Naomi remained near the back wall, unsure whether she should stay or leave. Every instinct told her that she no longer belonged in the room. Yet every time she took a step toward the door, another question appeared. Another discrepancy surfaced. Another discovery connected back to the original Japanese document. One of the Tokyo executives approached her again. "You may have saved both companies today," he said quietly. Naomi shook her head. "We do not know that yet." The executive smiled faintly. Most people would have stayed silent. Before Naomi could respond, a voice called from across the room. "We found it." Every conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned toward one of the senior attorneys sitting beside a laptop. The attorney's face had gone pale. Ethan crossed the room immediately. "You found the supplementary agreement?" The attorney nodded. "A backup copy." Ethan felt a surge of relief. "Good." The attorney did not return the relief. Instead, he slowly rotated the screen toward the room. "You need to read this." Silence returned. The document appeared on the monitor, several pages long, written primarily in Japanese. Naomi moved closer. So did the Tokyo executives. Attorneys began translating rapidly. The farther they read, the quieter the room became. Ethan watched their expressions carefully. Confusion became concern. Concern became disbelief. Then one attorney finally looked up. "This agreement transfers an additional 22% ownership position through a series of structured conversions." Ethan frowned. "To whom?" The attorney swallowed hard. "Entities connected to the acquisition group." Another lawyer immediately added, "Those entities ultimately report through investment structures controlled by Richard Coleman." The room froze. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Ethan slowly turned toward Richard. For the first time all afternoon, the investor's confidence appeared shaken. "That is not the full context," Richard said quickly. "Then explain the context," Ethan replied. Richard opened his mouth, but did not answer immediately. Across the room, Naomi continued reading the Japanese version. Something else caught her attention. Another clause. Another reference. Her eyes widened. "Wait." Everyone turned toward her again. Naomi pointed toward a paragraph near the end of the agreement. "This section is even worse." Several attorneys moved closer. "What does it say?" one asked. Naomi read carefully. Then she looked directly at Ethan. "These ownership transfers were not scheduled to happen after the partnership." Her voice was steady. "They were scheduled to happen immediately after your signature." Complete silence filled the room. Ethan stared at the document. $500 million. Months of negotiations. Dozens of experts. Hundreds of pages. And according to the original Japanese text, the moment he signed, control of a significant portion of his company would begin shifting away from him. Suddenly, the translation discrepancies no longer looked accidental. The missing agreement no longer looked administrative. And for the first time, Richard Coleman stopped trying to smile. The room remained frozen long after Naomi finished speaking. The significance of the clause settled over everyone at once. If Ethan had signed the agreement as presented, ownership transfers would have begun immediately. Not months later. Not after a transition period. Immediately. $500 million in assets and influence could have started moving beyond his control before anyone realized what had happened. Ethan Walker slowly looked around the room. Attorneys appeared stunned. Investors looked uneasy. Even the representatives from Tokyo seemed disturbed by what they were discovering. What had begun as a celebrated partnership now looked increasingly like a carefully constructed trap. Richard Coleman finally stepped forward. "You are drawing conclusions without full context." His voice remained controlled, but the confidence that had defined him earlier was fading. Ethan folded his arms. "Then provide the context." Richard opened his hands. "These structures are common in international transactions." Several attorneys immediately exchanged skeptical looks. One of them spoke up. "Not when they are hidden from one side of the agreement." Another added, "And certainly not when translation discrepancies conceal material changes." Richard's expression tightened. The room was no longer accepting simple explanations. Every answer now required evidence. Every statement required documentation. Ethan noticed that Richard had stopped looking at the contract itself. Instead, he watched the people around him. Their reactions, their doubts, their shifting loyalties. It was the behavior of someone losing control of a situation. Meanwhile, Naomi continued reviewing the Japanese text. Years earlier, while studying in Tokyo, she had learned that important details were often buried inside language that appeared routine. Legal documents rarely revealed their most significant intentions in large print. The most important information often hid inside ordinary-looking clauses. Her eyes moved carefully across another section. Then she stopped. A date. It seemed harmless at first glance. Yet the more she studied it, the stranger it became. "There is something else," she said quietly. Several attorneys immediately looked toward her. Ethan did too. By now, nobody in the room ignored her observations. "What did you find?" Ethan asked. Naomi pointed toward a section near the middle of the agreement. "This authorization date does not match the date listed in the English version." One attorney stepped forward. "Different by how much?" 3 months. The attorney's eyebrows rose. 3 months. Naomi nodded. According to the Japanese version, authorization was approved before negotiations officially began. Silence filled the room again. Ethan frowned. "That is impossible." "Exactly," Naomi replied. The lead attorney requested both versions immediately. Within minutes, legal teams compared the documents side by side. The result only deepened the concern. Naomi was correct. The Japanese authorization date predated several key meetings that supposedly led to the agreement. It suggested that parts of the structure had been planned long before the negotiations appeared to begin. Ethan felt a cold realization forming. He had spent months believing this was a partnership opportunity. What if, from the very beginning, someone had been working toward a completely different objective? One of the Tokyo executives leaned forward. "If these dates are authentic, someone expected this outcome long before discussions reached our board." Another executive nodded slowly. "Which means the ownership changes were never accidental." Richard immediately objected. "That is speculation." Yet his response sounded weaker now, defensive rather than confident. The momentum inside the room had shifted. Every new discovery pointed in the same direction. Translation discrepancies, missing agreements, hidden ownership transfers, altered dates. None of them benefited Ethan Walker. All of them benefited the same network of entities connected to Richard Coleman. Then one of the attorneys received a message on his laptop. His eyes widened as he read it. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully. Ethan turned. "What is it?" The attorney swallowed. "Our forensic accounting team just finished tracing the ownership structures." Ethan felt the room grow still again. "And?" The attorney slowly looked toward Richard. "The entities scheduled to receive the transferred ownership are not independent investment groups." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The attorney took a breath. "They are ultimately controlled by Richard Coleman himself." The words landed with the force of a confession. "They are ultimately controlled by Richard Coleman himself." Nobody in the room reacted immediately. The statement was too significant, too direct. For months, everyone had viewed Richard as a respected investor helping facilitate a major international partnership. Now the evidence suggested something entirely different. Ethan Walker remained silent as the forensic accounting report appeared on the large display screen. Charts filled the monitor. Ownership trees branched through layers of companies, trusts, and investment vehicles. Individually, the entities appeared unrelated. Together, they led back to the same destination. Richard Coleman. One attorney leaned forward. "Can this be verified?" The forensic specialist appearing through a secure video connection nodded. Multiple times. He enlarged another chart. These entities were structured specifically to conceal beneficial ownership. Ethan stared at the screen. The deeper the investigation went, the more deliberate everything appeared. The missing agreement, the altered dates, the translation discrepancies, the hidden ownership transfers. None of it looked accidental anymore. Across the room, Richard maintained his composure. But the confidence that once filled the room around him had vanished. "You are presenting a very selective interpretation," he said. "No," Ethan replied quietly. "We are looking at documents." The distinction mattered. Opinions could be challenged. Evidence could not. Several representatives from Tokyo requested copies of the forensic report. Attorneys immediately began reviewing additional files. Every new document seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. Richard had positioned himself to gain substantial influence through structures that were never clearly disclosed. Naomi watched from the back of the room. It felt surreal. Just hours earlier, she had been preparing coffee for guests. Now international attorneys were analyzing financial networks because she had questioned a translation. She still found it difficult to believe. One of the Japanese executives approached her again. "How did you notice the first discrepancy?" Naomi smiled faintly. The sentence sounded strange. The executive laughed softly. "Most people would never have recognized it." Naomi looked toward the screen. Most people were not reading it. The answer seemed simple, yet it carried a truth that nobody in the room could ignore. Important things are often missed because everyone assumes someone else already checked them. Suddenly, another attorney raised his hand. There is more. The room became quiet again. Ethan looked up. What now? The attorney displayed an internal memorandum recovered from archived communications. This was attached to one of the investment group records. Several people moved closer to read it. The document itself appeared ordinary, but one sentence immediately stood out. Upon completion of signing, governance leverage will transfer according to revised ownership schedule. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. Governance leverage. It was a corporate phrase. Technical. Unremarkable. To most people. Yet in context, its meaning was clear. Control. Influence. Authority. Everything the original agreement supposedly protected. Richard finally stood. This has gone far enough. For the first time all day, genuine frustration entered his voice. Several heads turned. Ethan remained calm. Actually, I think we are finally getting somewhere. Richard looked around the room. You are destroying a valuable partnership because of misunderstandings. One of the Tokyo executives immediately shook his head. No, the room became silent. The executive continued. The partnership was never the problem. He glanced toward the evidence displayed on the screen. The hidden terms were the problem. Richard did not respond. Because there was nothing left to say, the documents were speaking louder than anyone in the room. Ethan slowly walked toward the conference table. He looked at the contract, the translated version, the original Japanese version, the supplementary agreement, the forensic reports. Then he thought about the moment everything changed. A waitress carrying coffee had looked at a screen and noticed something nobody else did. One sentence, one correction, one decision not to stay silent. And now a scheme worth hundreds of millions of dollars was collapsing under the weight of its own paperwork. As attorneys continued organizing evidence, Ethan realized the truth was no longer hiding. The only question left was how many people had known about it from the beginning. The next 2 hours felt unlike anything Ethan Walker had experienced in his career. Major business negotiations were usually built around uncertainty, compromise, and risk. This was different. The uncertainty was disappearing. Every new document seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The hidden ownership transfers were real. The altered translations were real. The missing agreement was real. And the network of entities designed to benefit from those changes ultimately traced back to Richard Coleman. Attorneys continued organizing evidence across multiple screens. Financial specialists reviewed ownership structures. Representatives from Tokyo contacted their own legal teams for independent verification. Nobody was relying on assumptions anymore. Everything was being checked, confirmed, and documented. Richard remained seated near the far end of the conference table. The authority he had projected earlier was gone. He still attempted to challenge interpretations. He still questioned conclusions. But each objection was met with another document, another record, another confirmation. The weight of evidence had become impossible to ignore. Ethan stood beside the main display and reviewed the latest findings. One chart illustrated how ownership would have shifted immediately following his signature. Another showed how governance influence would gradually concentrate through affiliated entities. Looking at the diagrams, the strategy became obvious. Nobody planned to take control all at once. That would have attracted attention. Instead, control would have moved quietly through layers of transactions until it was too late to reverse. One of the senior attorneys closed a folder and looked toward Ethan. There is no scenario where we recommend signing this agreement. Ethan nodded. Understood. Across the room, the Japanese executives reached the same conclusion. Their chairman stood slowly. Our company will suspend all proceedings related to this transaction until a complete review is completed. No one objected. No one even seemed surprised. The deal was finished, at least in its current form. A silence settled over the room. Months of planning had ended without a single signature. Yet strangely, Ethan felt relief rather than disappointment. 5 hours earlier, he had believed this agreement represented the future of his company. Now he understood it might have destroyed that future instead. Richard finally rose from his chair. For the first time all day, he looked tired. Older. Smaller. You are making a mistake, he said. Ethan met his gaze. No, his voice remained calm. I almost made one. Richard looked around the room, perhaps hoping someone would support him. Nobody did. The attorneys focused on their files. The investors avoided eye contact. The representatives from Tokyo remained silent. The evidence had changed everything. After a few seconds, Richard collected his documents and walked toward the exit. No dramatic confrontation followed. No raised voices. No grand speeches. Just the quiet collapse of a plan that had depended on secrecy. The door closed behind him. The room remained silent for several moments afterward. Then one of the Japanese executives slowly turned toward Naomi Bennett. "I believe we owe you our gratitude." Several others nodded immediately. Naomi felt uncomfortable with the attention. "I only pointed out what I saw." The executive smiled. Most people would not have looked closely enough to see it. Ethan found himself thinking the same thing. Hundreds of highly educated professionals had reviewed the agreement. Experienced attorneys, financial analysts, corporate advisors. Yet the person who stopped everything was a waitress carrying coffee through the room. Not because she had power, not because she had influence, because she paid attention. As people began gathering documents and preparing to leave, Ethan walked toward the large window overlooking Manhattan. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers below. The city looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Yet everything had changed. Behind him, attorneys continued discussing next steps. Representatives exchanged business cards. Investigators organized records. The truth was no longer hidden inside legal language. It was sitting openly on conference room tables. And at the center of it all stood a woman who had simply refused to ignore a sentence that did not sound right. 3 days later, the headlines were everywhere. Business networks discussed the collapsed transaction. Financial analysts debated the implications. Corporate attorneys examined the documents that had halted one of the largest proposed deals of the year. Yet inside Sakura Crown Manhattan, the lunch rush continued exactly as it always had. Plates moved from kitchen to table. Conversations filled the dining room. Guests arrived and departed without realizing that a waitress working among them had recently changed the course of a $500 million transaction. Naomi Bennett preferred it that way. She returned to work the following week wearing the same black apron, carrying the same menus, and greeting customers with the same quiet professionalism. Most people never knew her story. Late one afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the restaurant windows, the manager approached her. "Someone requested a private meeting," he said. Naomi looked surprised. "With me?" The manager nodded. "Conference Suite 3. Naomi thanked him and walked toward the private area. When she opened the door, she immediately recognized Ethan Walker standing beside a large window overlooking the city. He turned and smiled. "I hope I am not interrupting your shift." Naomi smiled politely. "Not at all." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable, very different from the tension that had filled the room during their first meeting. Ethan finally looked out toward the skyline. "I have spent the last few days answering questions from attorneys, investors, and reporters." Naomi laughed softly. "That sounds exhausting." "It is." Ethan smiled. Then his expression grew more thoughtful. But there was one question nobody asked. Naomi waited. How did a waitress become the smartest person in the room? Naomi lowered her eyes slightly and laughed again. "I was not the smartest person in the room." Ethan shook his head. "You noticed what everyone else missed." He reached into his jacket and placed a small folded sheet of paper on the table. Naomi recognized it immediately. It was a copy of the sentence she had corrected during the meeting, the sentence that changed everything. Ethan looked at it for a moment. Hundreds of professionals reviewed these documents. He smiled. Yet the person who saved the company was carrying a coffee tray. Naomi did not know what to say. Ethan continued. "You never asked for recognition. You never asked for money. You never tried to benefit from what happened." He looked directly at her. "You simply told the truth." The room grew quiet. Outside the window, Manhattan continued moving beneath the late afternoon sun. Ethan placed a business card on the table. "This is not a reward," he said. "And it is not charity." Naomi glanced at the card. It contained contact information for a newly created International Strategy Fellowship inside Walker Global Holdings. Ethan smiled. "It is an opportunity." Naomi looked up. "Why?" Ethan folded his hands. "Because intelligence is valuable." He paused. "But integrity is priceless." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that comes when someone finally feels seen for who they are rather than how they are perceived. Ethan looked out across the city one final time. A week earlier, He believed power came from money, influence, and ownership. Now he understood something far more important. Titles can command attention. Wealth can open doors. Position can fill a room with people willing to listen. But none of those things guarantee wisdom. Sometimes the person who changes the future is not sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes she is standing quietly beside it. And sometimes a single sentence, spoken by someone everyone underestimated, can reveal the truth that hundreds of experts failed to see.